Hi, everybody. So it's been another 2 weeks, and thankfully, we have seen the COVID trend continue downwards. And so this is going to be the last update for a while. There are some interesting things to share with you guys, which hopefully you will also find interesting and useful. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen with you. Alrighty. So just a general overview, there are still hotspots around the world, Europe, Australia, Russia, places like South Korea and New Zealand. But overall in the US and California, cases and hospitalizations continue to come down. Mortality continues to decrease. In California, it's vacillating a little, but hopefully that will continue to decrease as well. So starting with the variants, last time I showed you this, I told you about 3.9% of all the variants of Omicron in the US, because everything is Omicron now in the US, was BA.2. And you can see that has increased slightly to this 8.3%. But when you look overall at the geographic regions, you can see that that is kind of across the board, that the part of the pie chart that is BA.2 is increasing since last time. But thankfully, there is this new data that's come out. This is a preprint publication. And there is data showing that protection of an Omicron sublineage infection, like either BA.1 or BA.2, against reinfection again from another Omicron sublineage. So there is some cross immunity, even though the actual variants themselves are quite different, genetically speaking. So that is great news. What that means is that even as BA.2 continues to gradually increase, we are unlikely to see another major surge because so many of us are already immune to one type of Omicron. And in Santa Clara County in particular, remember that this website is a little bit behind, but there are about 8,400 cases of the Omicron variant up to date thus far in Santa Clara. When we start looking at vaccination, you can again see the US is kind of hanging out right around the same place it has been for a long time. Almost 65% of the population vaccinated with 2 doses, but not quite. And when you think about fully vaccinated in the US, that means with the 2 doses, but in more and more countries around the world, really, they're considering that 3 doses. So for us, with just 2 doses, we only have 69% of the population over age 5 that's vaccinated, doing a little bit better on the age over 65 at 88.8%. But you can see, as far as those eligible to get a booster, only 43.8% have gotten them. And this is significant because of all the data that I've shared with you before about how significantly improved your immunity is against Omicron or any of its sublineages when you get that booster dose. You can see that overall people are much less likely to be getting vaccine doses these days. Of course, as the fear and threat of a surge wane, so does the impetus to get vaccinated. So you can see it's really down to 0.45 million a day. Overall, across the country, people are sort of just trending slightly, but no major shifts. You can see that thankfully, finally, Alabama has caught up with the rest of the country and now has over 50% of its residents vaccinated, which is great. And there have been some good shifts in Nebraska and Minnesota in the last couple of weeks also. When you look at California, you can see the trend is mirrored in that US type of vaccine doses, where really trended downward to really not a very high rate, just about 0.05 million on a 7-day average. When you look overall by group, you can see similarly to what we have seen in the past, overall, California does quite well compared to the US over full age range. But when we look at that age over 65, we're actually lagging quite a bit, 82.5% versus 88.8% in the over 65 category. When you look at Santa Clara County, however, we're doing really great. We're at 94% overall in the 18 and older group. Even 72.8% of our adolescents are vaccinated 5 through 17. And you can see the percent of the booster eligible residents who have received a booster dose is above 68%, which is much better than the national average. And even when you look at our elderly population, even in the rest of California is not doing as well. We are far outstripping the rest of the country at 95%. When you look at global cases, you can see, thankfully, that nice downward trend continues, 30% decrease in the last 2 weeks. When you're looking at hotspots, what's interesting is that there are areas that are cooling down now, like North America, South America, but areas like South Korea, New Zealand, Hong Kong, areas that up to now have done a really great job actually of keeping their case numbers low. Omicron is so contagious that it has broken through even in these areas, even in spite of all of their policies. And now they're seeing the sort of their Omicron surge as the rest of the world comes off of theirs. You can see this in this graph really nicely, where you see Israel spiked really highly in cases, but has come down. The UK, the US also similarly, but Hong Kong, South Korea, New Zealand, they were flat all this time, and now you can start seeing their sharp rise. When you look at cases nationally, you can see this really nice downward trend. And when you look overall at the hotspots, you can see this kind of mirrors the same thing as we saw in the global hotspot map, where areas like Maine, for example, that kind of had been holding out really nicely, well-vaccinated population, now they're actually seeing a surge of Omicron as well. When you look at cases in California, those are coming down really nicely. And that is mirrored in Santa Clara County and also in San Mateo County. And when you look at Stanford, finally, we have a really nice downward trend. This isn't quite up to date. It was last updated on the 27th of February, but overall 67 in the last week within the Stanford students. But compared to the weeks prior, being down in the double digits looks really good again. And Stanford faculty, postdocs, and staff have been in the double digits now for a few weeks, but we're continuing to trend down nicely, down in the teens at this point. So that looks great. And when we look at SARS-CoV-2 in pediatrics, you can look at this more when I send out the slides, but there's a lot of headlines lately that are talking about how the vaccines are not effective at preventing Omicron in adolescents, that age group 5 to 17-year-old. And what I would say is a better headline would have been to focus on this highlighted data, which actually shows that the booster in the same age group is highly effective in preventing infection. And so, instead of, certainly it's true that 2 doses is not enough, and that's why many countries don't consider 2 doses a full vaccination anymore. And so if you just get a booster, then you will be fully vaccinated. So, when you think about overall the change in child COVID-19 cases, we are at the highest point overall of what share of the population is represented in pediatrics of COVID-19 patients. So they represented 26.2% in this last week, and that is definitely the highest it has been in the pandemic. Thankfully, the hospitalization and mortality rate remain very low in this population. When you look at hospitalizations, you can see that is also trending down really nicely in the US. And when you look at in California, also coming down really nicely, both overall hospitalization as well as ICU. And when you look at Santa Clara County, that's also coming down really nicely, as is San Mateo County. So everyone decreasing really nicely. And in San Francisco itself, you can see that really nice steep decrease off of the peak there. When you think about mortality, thankfully, it has come down. Certainly, a lot of deaths per day still, close to 2,000 deaths per day is nothing to laugh about. Definitely better than what it was at our peak, but certainly nowhere near where we would want to be down at our baseline before this pandemic occurred. When you look at mortality in California, you can see that little bit of a vacillation at the end of the graph there, and that's hard to know exactly what that's showing. Perhaps it's simply artifact from reporting on different days, but hopefully that continues to trend downward. We'll keep an eye on that. And thankfully in Santa Clara County, also trending downwards. I'll leave you with 2 things. One is this really interesting prize-winning essay in immunology that was published in Science magazine by Paul Bastard. And it's looking at why do people die from COVID-19? Specifically, why are the elderly so much more likely to die from this disease? And looking not just at the elderly, but other people in which this infection was more severe, they found that there are autoantibodies that develop as we age towards particular types of interferons, type 1 interferons in our bodies. And we know that interferon is a molecule that plays a large role in fighting viral infections. And this may be a significant finding, not just for COVID-19, but for many other flu-like illnesses like influenza itself, like many other viral illnesses that have a more severe presentation as we get older. And I think that this is going to be a really interesting way of trying to develop prevention strategies for mortality and morbidity, not just with COVID-19, but likely many other viral illnesses that we see. So that's really interesting news. And I'll leave you with this. Obviously what's at the top of everybody's mind right now in the news is Ukraine. And it is really interesting what information has to do with really everything in our society at this point. The flow of information, the control of information, and who gets to see what information is really what determines what we know, not just about pandemics, but about justification for war and everything in between. You can see that when you look at this recent data from Russia, there's what they call a dubious lack of variation. And the quote is, "A back of the envelope calculation shows that such a low variation week would occur by chance just once every 2,747 years. So thankfully, regardless of what information people are trying to put out there, if it is not true, science is going to be the way for us to find out. And we will continue to depend on science. I hope all of you do as well. I hope that was helpful. And I hope, fingers crossed, that I will not have to be making more reports for you guys. In the indefinite future, there are none more scheduled, but certainly if anything arises, I will let you know. All right, have a great rest of the year.